I remember years ago I was talking to a couple of friends of mine who talked about how they decided to get married. And so basically they were looking for a sign of some sort. So they went on this pilgrimage to Rome. And I think they went to one church and they were kind of kneeling down and they were looking for a sign. And as the bride tells it, basically the groom produced a ring. And so initially she thought, well, this must be the sign. But then the ring didn't fit. And then she thought, well, what's the sign? The fact that I got a ring or the fact that the ring didn't fit? But then eventually they decided to get married in spite of that whole business with the sign. And I have to admit for myself, I love that story because it's kind of funny, but it also speaks to the fact that we have these theories about things involving the spiritual life in terms of discernment and evangelization, which aren't actually grounded in what God actually wants us to do. And so a lot of times when it comes to discernment, what do you typically hear? The way to figure out the thing you're supposed to do or the way to figure out your vocation is to kind of go to the Lord, ideally before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, and just kind of like hammer it out, right? So I'm just going to force the Lord to reveal His will to me just by praying really intently, again, before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Or, beg the Lord to give me a sign of some sort. And certainly I don't want to flat out discount either of those particular modes of discernment. So I'm sure there's been moments in the past where people have discovered their vocation or the thing they're supposed to do by discovering a particular sign from the Lord or really hammering out before the Lord in a sense of prayer before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. But I would suggest that for the most part, when it comes to discernment, what you're supposed to do is basically some version of this. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. Live your life. Don't stay in the basement and kind of worry and just think about the mysteries of the universe, but live your life, be faithful in terms of where does the Lord want me to be, what does He want me to do, focusing on a few things He wants to do carefully and well, and slowly, gradually, over time, the Lord will reveal your vocation or the thing that He wants you to do. You find a similar thing, to be honest, when it comes to evangelization. And so I don't know about you, but when I see people trying to evangelize other people, whether we're talking about family, friends, coworkers, whatever, you often see this kind of aggressiveness. Like I'm going to beat you to submission by way of my argument and rhetorical approach. So you're forced to become Catholic or forced to become Christian. Certainly there's something to be said about apologetics, right? Being able to explain your faith, right? Mindful of 1 Peter chapter 3. You're meant to have the capacity to give an explanation for the reason of the hope which is within you. Certainly that's true. But at the same time, when it comes to evangelization, you got to remember that ultimately it's about leading people into a stance of relationship, friendship, covenantal love, not unlike marriage, right? And so based on that particular understanding, you can't force someone to go the way of discipleship. In the same way, you can't force someone to fall in love or get married. They have to choose it. Hence that common expression that the church is meant to propose as opposed to impose. And funny enough, that's precisely what you see in the gospel, right? And so think, for example, of the road to Emmaus, right? So this is immediately after the crucifixion, right? So the disciples are scattered because of fear, because of their sin, all sorts of things. And you see this highlighted when it comes to the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, right? So they're walking away from Jerusalem, the site of the crucifixion, the site of suffering love, and walking away from basically the Lord, who reveals Himself to us through the crucifixion. And then what happens? The Lord has this amazing reality in His heart, this amazing reality that He's lived through and is living through, the reality of the resurrection. And so He has this desire to share the fullness of that particular truth and reality with these two disciples. But He's also, at the same time, prudent. So what does He do? He accompanies them. And so He notices that they're sad. He notices that they're forlorn. And begins asking them questions. Why are you sad? Why do you seem depressed? And then He listens to them express their concerns. And you don't get a sense that it's kind of like 5 minutes and then, okay, you're done talking, now I'm going to speak for an hour. There's a sense of patience and again, journeying with. I give you all sorts of space to self-disclose. What's on your mind? What is it that you actually are afraid of? Why do you have a certain apprehension still in your heart? Why have you lost hope? He gives all sorts of space and room for these people to self-disclose, to share, and you get the sense that He also asks questions to further understand what's on their hearts, what's on their minds, how they're actually struggling. But then what does He do? After listening to them, after asking clarifying questions, He explains to them the things about Himself in light of the Scriptures, but also in light of their experience. So even now, even though He's speaking, even though He's teaching them, it's also a communication. It remains communication where I'm speaking to you truths in light of your experience, so it remains practical, it remains relevant. And then, of course, what finally happens at the end of the story, He reveals Himself to them through the breaking of the bread, all the while being with them in a stance of table fellowship. And then, of course, what we hear is that the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they reflect on the whole experience. And they say, well, gosh, were our hearts burning within us as he was speaking to us, as he was explaining the scriptures to us? And at that point, they don't have to be told what to do. They willingly and enthusiastically go forth to spread the good news, to share with their fellow disciples everything they have seen and heard. To further illustrate the point, I want to share with you a story that I once heard from Noelle Marin. And so just to kind of paraphrase, Noelle was talking about a friend of hers who became heavily steeped in liberal theology and philosophy, as a result of which he began to deconstruct and question basically everything, as a result of which he saw no truth, no meaning, as a result of which he fell into a certain despair, and at a certain point he even tried to kill himself. And so he realized, well, gosh, I'm kind of in a bad spot. And so he began to speak to a colleague who was really bright, really intellectual. But what's interesting is that his friend and his colleague didn't try to convince him of the Christian thing by going the way of debate or argumentation, but instead he was very simple, very ordinary. So basically he invited him to church, and then afterwards they went to have dinner with this family who went to that same church. And the way the story goes, the dinner wasn't too fancy, right? So kind of a bag salad and frozen pizza. And it was a large family, and so a lot of the kids were acting out. But at the same time, the parents, they weren't frustrated, they weren't angry, as this guy had expected from his experiences with his own family. But instead, they maintained a sense of good cheer. They were fun, they were normal, they told jokes, they made light of it all, and they kind of got through it. And the family wasn't perfect, but they kind of made the thing peaceful and normal, joy in the midst of everyday, ordinary life. It was so compelling to this guy that he wanted to go back to church the next weekend because I wanted to go back to dinner with that family. And Noelle Marin, she kind of punctuated this whole story by saying that there's been a recent trend in recent years when it comes to evangelization, right? And so basically back in the day, there was this kind of like push towards a certain renewal in terms of apologetics, led by people like Scott Hahn and whatnot. And then around the turn of the century, there was this emphasis on leading with the beautiful, led by people such as Bishop Barron, mindful of the fact that the beautiful can be less threatening as opposed to the good or the true, which lead people to think a certain way or do a certain thing, right? Whereas in contrast, the beautiful simply invites you to look in a non-threatening way, which hopefully ideally leads one to the true and to the good. In any case, and kind of more to the point, you said that recently there's been a trend towards evangelization by way of the ordinary, which on the face of it might sound kind of new, but in reality is a certain kind of revisiting of foundational truths when it comes to the evangelical approach as rooted in the gospel. And so never mind the road to Emmaus, like think about all those parables that you find in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13 dealing with the kingdom of heaven, the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, and so on and so forth. The common denominator with regards to all these different parables is that the way to bring about the gospel in the context of people's lives is not to do something rushed or forced or flashy, but to go the way of the simple and the humble and the ordinary. Simple stuff, seemingly insignificant stuff, which bears fruit over a long period of time. One final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so Brett Powell, this really notable Catholic speaker, was once speaking to someone named Chris Bruno, who wrote about being a sage. And basically Chris Bruno was asked the question by Brett Powell, what's a sage? And in response, basically the answer was, a sage is not someone who is simply wise. There's a lot of people who are wise. In contrast, a sage waits to be asked a question. And the whole point is that a lot of us think that the way to go is to simply talk at people, all the while forgetting that there's something to be said about communication and relationship. And so I can give lectures, I can speak to people in all sorts of different ways, but what's actually going on in people's hearts? How are they receiving the thing which is said or the thing which is being done? And how are they changing and responding as a consequence? And you see, if I forget about that, if I forget that even when I'm speaking, I'm engaged in communication and relationship, then I'm sort of like a noisy gong and a clashing cymbal, simply making noise, simply saying words, without taking into account how they're actually being received, which in reality is not so much wise, but is very much the opposite. And so given all that, the invitation is to go the way of what we might call synodality, a certain journeying with each other where we listen to each other and allow that listening to inform all of us. And you see, practically speaking, what that means going forth is basically this. The next time you listen to someone, don't simply presume that you're listening just because you're not talking. Really listen to them. Listen to them and ask them, again, clarifying questions, and allow that process of authentic listening to inform your thoughts, to inform what you say next. Because when you do that, you're not simply respecting the relationship. You're not simply respecting the foundational principles behind the whole dynamic of communication. You're actually modeling for the other person what it means to engage in a spirit of synodality. I am listening to you. I'm interested in you. I'm asking questions to further understand what you're actually saying to me. And hopefully you'll do the same thing, as a result of which our communication is richer, our relationship is deeper, and our sense of community and our ability to accomplish amazing things in the context of that same community is so much more strong, so much more dynamic, so much more of the Lord. And may God bless you all.